Carol Rosenberg, thank you again.
Thank you.
We are waiting for President Obama to speak in the White House briefing room about Ukraine in just a few moments. Joining us now is NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker. Kristen, give us a sense, do we have any sense of what the president may say here?
Well, I think he's going to reiterate, potentially in stronger terms, what we have heard from this administration over the past several days, which is that Russia should not intervene in Ukraine. And of course, this comes as we are getting reports from Ukrainian officials that Russian forces, Russian helicopters, transport vehicles have entered Ukraine. In fact, one official saying that Russian officials have actually taken over Ukraine's or Crimea's main airport. U.S. officials telling NBC News they have no reason to doubt what officials in Ukraine are saying, obviously monitoring this situation quite closely. You will recall that Susan Rice, the national security advisor, said last week that if Russia were to intervene, it would be a grave mistake. Strong words all week long from this administration. Secretary Kerry saying today that he spoke with Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, earlier today, again telling Russia not to engage. So that is what we have been hearing all along. President Obama will undoubtedly come out with some stern words. What he will say specifically, we'll have to wait and see. But of course, earlier today, the former president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, came out and said that he has not been deposed, that he still sees himself as the leader of Ukraine, despite the fact that the United States and certainly many people within Ukraine do not see the situation in that light. So President Obama will come out. I expect him to have strong words from Russia. Clearly, this situation and Russia entering that space only increasing tensions between the East and the West and between the United States and Russia. U.S. officials have said all week long that this is not a return to the Cold War. But, Alex, there is no doubt that if Russia has, in fact, engaged and entered Ukraine, that will increase these tensions, increase what has been a very frosty relationship between the United States and Russia as of late.
You know,
Alex?
Kristen, we spoke with National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes last Friday, specifically about the issue of U.S.-Russian relations. And Ben revealed that the president had spoken to President Putin on Friday for an hour. Which is quite a long time.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if you've gotten any readout on the last time the two spoke, whether they've spoken this week, or just sort of where we are diplomatically with the Russians at this moment.
Right. Well, we don't have any indication that they have spoken this week. Of course, that is certainly possible that they have and that we haven't gotten a readout of that phone call. But no word on them speaking over the past several days. But you're absolutely right to point out the fact that it was significant that the two leaders had that hour-long conversation. They have not spoken for quite some time. And you'll recall that President Obama actually canceled a bilateral meeting that the two leaders were supposed to have last year. That certainly was a snub. And that comes because there have been so many tensions between the United States and Russia as of late, whether it be Syria, Iran, of course, Edward Snowden. So this is just one more thing, Alex, that is adding to those tensions. The president trying to reach out to Putin, urging him not to engage, but it seems like that might not be the case right now. Alex.
Kristen, stick with us. We're going to take a short break. We are waiting for the president to speak in the White House briefing room on Ukraine in just a few moments. We will, of course, bring you those remarks live when we get them. That's just ahead.
Did it. Why We Did It, hosted by Rachel Maddow, Thursday at 9 on MSNBC.
We urge all parties, that includes the new interim technical government and rightists and oppositionists and others, anybody in the street who is armed, we urge all parties to avoid any steps that could be misinterpreted or lead to miscalculation or do anything other than to work to bring peace and stability and peaceful transition within the governing process of Ukraine.
That was Secretary of State John Kerry speaking earlier today on the situation in Ukraine. We are waiting for President Obama to speak from the White House about the crisis there. Joining us now from the briefing room is NBC's Peter Alexander. Peter, do we have any sense of what the president may address? How much of it will be an echo of what the Secretary of State said earlier today?
Yeah, Alex, we're not exactly certain what we will hear from the president just a short time from now when he does walk into this briefing room, but he will certainly echo some of the comments that we have heard from other administration officials, including Press Secretary Jay Carney, who in this room only a short time ago said in the administration's language that intervention is, as he described it, a grave mistake. He also emphasized that the U.S. supports the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine. We've been reaching out to administration officials over the course of the day trying to find out more information about those forces that have been entering Crimea, that region within Ukraine today. And U.S. administration officials, as you have reported, confirmed that uniformed Russian forces, apparently a hybrid of military and paramilitary forces, are still flying into that region today. They could not confirm the exact numbers, but they did not question the fact, no reason to doubt. They said the basic information that they are Russians arriving on Russian aircraft as we speak right now. We expect that the president may comment on a potential conversation he would have had with Vladimir Putin. We know the last time those two men spoke was exactly a week ago. But make no mistake, these are severe, significant consequences that Russia could face, whether they're military consequences. It's clear the U.S. has little it could do in terms of military efforts at this time, Alex. But obviously the president on this stage wants to make it very clear that the U.S. is watching and there will be consequences.
Thank you, Peter. I want to swing over to the White House North Lawn where NBC's Kristen Welker is. Kristen, you know, what's interesting here is so much of our sort of main foreign policy priorities right now hinge on Russian cooperation. That could be a nuclear deal on Iran. It could be some kind of resolution to the situation in Syria. And there is a sense, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, that this White House has been a little bit more hesitant in around certain issues because Russia is such a major player in so many areas. Certainly the White House feels like they have been, they have to and must comment on this, given the situation over there. But one would expect that they're going to tread a fairly careful line here, given the other priorities at hand.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and that has been a big criticism of this White House, of this administration, that they haven't been strong enough, that the president hasn't been strong enough on some of these foreign policy issues. When you look at a case like Syria, for example, where he sort of walked up to the brink of taking military action and then decided to put that in Congress's hands. And then, of course, the administration was able to find another diplomatic route so that became unnecessary. And then on Iran, a lot of people say the pending deal is not tough enough. So this is certainly another test for this president, for this administration. It will be interesting to see what specifically the president says, whether he just uses stern words, more of the rhetoric that we've been hearing, or if he actually threatens to take some type of action. If he draws a red line, for example, Alex, that's certainly something that I'll be listening for. Alex.
Thank you, Kristen. Joining us now is the editor of Politico magazine and our resident Putin whisperer, Susan Glasser. Susan, what is Vladimir Putin doing here? The Olympics are over. The attention of the world is maybe less on Russia than it was a week ago. But what do you think he is trying to achieve here? Is this just a show of force for his own sort of purposes, or do you legitimately think that some kind of occupation may be beginning?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to not count out anything with Vladimir Putin. He's shown in the past that this is his own backyard, and he's going to be very, very aggressive here. This is not a case of international diplomacy and getting one up on the Obama administration in Syria or something. This is literally in Russia's, what it considers its historic sphere of influence. And it has shown in the past that it is willing to use military force when necessary to enforce itself in its sphere of influence. Remember that it was the Georgia war between Russia and Georgia, when Russia invaded Georgia just a few years ago, that spelled the low point of relations between the Bush administration and Vladimir Putin.
Well, Susan, what do you make of the relationship between the President Obama, and President Putin at this point?
Well, you know, I would say that certainly it's cooled off considerably from its start. And I think that, you know, there was talk of could we try to get these two leaders again back together for a one-on-one meeting. That hasn't happened. President Obama very visibly snubbed the Sochi Olympics, which were meant to be the big show of Vladimir Putin's accomplishments in Russia. They actually canceled the meeting that was supposed to be held, the one-on-one meeting between Putin and Obama in September. So right now, the relationship would be characterized as frosty at best.
And what do you think this does measurably in terms of scuttling or complicating the deal with Iran that the Russians have been very active on in terms of its nuclear weapons program?
Well, I think that's an important point. Remember that we can't just afford to ignore or freeze out Russia, even if we very much disapprove of what they're doing in their own backyard. And so that's a very complicated situation. I think we're going to have to wait and see what President Obama says right now.
We are awaiting his word. Politico Magazine, Susan Glasser, thanks for coming in and pinch hitting. That is all for now. The Ed Show will pick up our coverage coming up right up.
Good evening, Americans, and welcome to the Ed Show live from New York tonight. We're awaiting the President of the United States, his statement about the political unrest in the country of Ukraine. Now, the latest reports from the region say armed militants have occupied 2 airports in the area. Members of the Ukraine's government say the men were troops deployed from Russia. The Kremlin is denying these claims. Earlier today, Ukraine's ousted president, Viktor Yanukovych, speaking in Russian from inside Russia, insisted he remains the legitimate leader of Ukraine. Yanukovych is wanted for murders of hundreds of protesters in the country. The Kremlin says it will continue to respect the sovereignty of its neighbor. Secretary of State John Kerry made a call for peace on all sides. And of course, on Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered a surprise military exercise on the border of Ukraine with 150,000 Russian troops. The Russian flag was planted on top of Crimea's parliament building. Militants took control of the government's building there, and pro-Russian demonstrators filled the streets. Joining me now is Kristen Welker of NBC News. Great to have you with us tonight. What can we expect the president to talk about, Kristen?
Well, and I think you're going to hear stern words from President Obama to give you a sense of what we've been hearing from this administration all week. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney, National Security Advisor Susan Rice have all said it would be a grave mistake for Russia to intervene in Ukraine. U.S. officials at this hour confirming that that is essentially what has happened, saying that uniformed Russian forces, apparently a hybrid of military and paramilitary, are still flying into Simferopol, and that is a region in Crimea. And the Ukraine's UN ambassador telling the UN Security Council that Russian military forces have taken over their main airport there. So if this is in fact the case, if Russia has in fact entered Ukraine, this will not only increase tensions in that region between the East and the West, certainly, but also continue to freeze the relationship between the United States and Russia. And, you know, Ed, one of the things that has been discussed throughout this entire incident and issue in Ukraine is what is the state of the relationship between the United States and Russia. U.S. officials have been very adamant that this is not a return to the Cold War. And yet when you see something like this happening, if Russia has in fact invaded Ukraine at this point, it will undoubtedly just continue to create a larger gulf between the two nations. So that is the backdrop to the president coming out to the Brady press briefing room momentarily. We expect him to come out any minute now. And again, I anticipate that he will have very stern words for Russia. The question is, will he draw a red line? If so, what will the consequences be? Those are some of the things that I will be listening quite closely for. And it's also worth noting, Ed, that the former president of Ukraine, as you pointed out, Yanukovych, has left Ukraine. He held a news conference earlier today saying that he has not been deposed. He is still the leader of that country. Of course, many within Ukraine don't see it that way. So the situation continues to be volatile there and quite unpredictable. And President Obama will come out momentarily and address it all.
And we are inside the 2-minute warning on that. Kristen Welker at the White House. Stay with us, obviously. We want to go to Jim Masada on the line with us on the phone from Moscow. Jim, we're told that the President of the United States and also Vladimir Putin have had words and spoken to one another on the phone. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I don't have any insight into that phone conversation. I can tell you that having watched the situation unfold here from my perch in Moscow and with my contacts into the Kremlin, that we cannot underestimate the reaction, the deep sense of betrayal, in fact, that President Putin feels at this point, given the way events eventually unfolded. He and his administration, the Kremlin, was under the impression that one thing was going to happen, that February 21st agreement was going to lead to a series of benchmarks, a timeline that would have taken Yanukovych, kept him in power until the end of the year, and then suddenly everything was flipped on its ear. Putin found himself outside of the loop as all of these forces, a whole new group of people that Putin mistrusts profoundly, were suddenly calling the shots, not from inside Kiev's parliament, but from the streets of Kiev. And
let's go now to President Obama at the White House. Thank you, Jim.
The United States has been responding to events as they unfold in Ukraine. Now, throughout this crisis, we have been very clear about one fundamental principle. The Ukrainian people deserve the opportunity to determine their own future. Together with our European allies, we have urged an end to the violence and encouraged Ukrainians to pursue a course in which they stabilize their country, forge a broad-based government, and move to elections this spring. I also spoke several days ago with President Putin, and my administration has been in daily communication with Russian officials. And we've made clear that they can be part of an international community's effort to support the stability and success of a united Ukraine going forward, which is not only in the interest of the people of Ukraine and the international community, but also in Russia's interests. However, we are now deeply concerned by reports of military movements taken by the Russian Federation inside of Ukraine. Russia has a historic relationship with Ukraine, including cultural and economic ties, and a military facility in Crimea. But any violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be deeply destabilizing, which is not in the interest of Ukraine, Russia, or Europe. It would represent a profound interference in matters that must be determined by the Ukrainian people. It would be a clear violation of Russia's commitment to respect the independence and sovereignty and borders of Ukraine and of international laws. And just days after the world came to Russia for the Olympic Games, it would invite the condemnation of nations around the world. And indeed, the United States will stand with the international community in affirming that there will be costs for any military intervention in Ukraine. The events of the past several months remind us of how difficult democracy can be in a country with deep divisions. But the Ukrainian people have also reminded us that human beings have a universal right to determine their own future. Right now, the situation remains very fluid. Vice President Biden just spoke with the Prime Minister of Ukraine to assure him that in this difficult moment, the United States supports his government's efforts and stands for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and democratic future of Ukraine. I also commend the Ukrainian government's restraint and its commitment to uphold its international obligations. We will continue to coordinate closely with our European allies. We will continue to communicate directly with the Russian government, and we will continue to keep all of you in the press corps and the American people informed as events develop. Thanks very much.
President Obama with a brief statement at the White House about what he calls crisis in Ukraine. Let's go back to Kristen Welker at the White House. Very clear, deeply concerned and deeply destabilizing. Those are strong words for the Russian president, I think. Kristen, how do you see that?
I think that's the headline. Yeah, I think that's absolutely the headline. That is sort of the one phrase that was different that we heard from the president. You heard him say that the U.S. is deeply concerned about the situation now, warning Russia again not to basically raise the specter of military intervention in Ukraine. What he didn't do, though, was to threaten any action on the part of the United States. He made it very clear that Vice President Biden has been in contact with the Prime Minister of Ukraine, commended the new government there on the restraint that it has shown. Again, this was a stern warning to Russia. It is what we expected President Obama to say. It was a brief statement. It was to some extent a reiteration of what we have heard. But again, that phrase there, Ed, that you point out, deeply concerned, is the headline. It is this White House essentially upping the ante and saying, we're watching what you're doing and we're not going to just stand by.
We can only speculate if the president is concerned about sovereignty and there are military actions by the Russian Federation inside the Ukraine. We can only speculate what kind of conversation the president and Mr. Putin had about that. And you profoundly point out, Kristen, that there were no words of any kind of military action whatsoever. But the question begs, what will it take for the United States to possibly get involved? And does the Russian Federation and these troops have to back off? I mean, it's very interesting the president didn't take any questions because certainly he didn't want to inflame the situation. This is a very, very tense diplomatic situation at this point. That's and deeply destabilizing, I think, is really code that Mr. Putin, you better back off here. How else could we take that? Kristen, your thoughts on that?
I think that's absolutely right. And what you're going to see over the next 24 hours, Ed, flurry of conversations, certainly between the White House, this administration, and Russian officials. And it is such a fragile situation because if this does escalate into some type of actual violence, that is certainly going to change the equation. It's going to change the equation for the administration, for the folks on the ground in Ukraine, and obviously for Russia. So it is going to be a tense weekend here at the White House, undoubtedly, as they continue to monitor this situation. And in those phone calls that they will have, they're going to reiterate what you heard the president say. And to your point, Ed, probably make the point that the United States will take some type of action. I don't know that it would be military action, but some type of action if this situation in Ukraine currently turns violent.
And of course, we'll get reaction sometime this evening from Capitol Hill, I'm sure. Kristen Welker at the White House, thank you for joining us on the Ed Show tonight and that coverage. You're watching the Ed Show. We'll be right back here on MSNBC.